Okay, we are on the air. Hello, this is Karen Jensen from the Teen Librarian Toolbox, and we are starting our next Sexual Violence in Young Adult Literature Google Hangout. Today we are talking about the end of the world, post-apocalyptic and dystopian fiction for young adults. And we are being joined by Elizabeth Fama, the author of Plus One, Ilsa J. Bick, the author of the Ashes trilogy, and several other books. And Mindy McGinnis, the author of Not a Drop to Drink, and the sequel in A Handful of Dust came out yesterday, I believe. So we are going to start by having them, yes, we're going to have them each introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their book and give us a brief overview before we get started. So we're going to start with Mindy.
Okay, I am Mindy McGinnis. My debut novel is Not a Drop to Drink, which came out last year today. It's 1 year old. And this book takes place in a world where freshwater is almost non-existent. There is a freshwater shortage, not necessarily because of drought or any kind of natural disaster, but because of a simple population outstripping supply. And in this world, my main character, Lynn, lives in the country. And out in the country, you have a pond, you have a hand-dug well, you have a source of water. People in the city don't. So the cities are emptying out, and people that live in the country have to defend their water sources, usually quite violently. And so my main character grows up in this way, and that is Not a Drop to Drink. The sequel, In a Handful of Dust, just came out yesterday. It's more of a companion novel. It takes place 10 years after the events in Not a Drop to Drink. And it has shared characters and shared setting, but that is why it's a companion novel as opposed to a sequel, because it doesn't pick up the action. It is a decade later. And those are my books.
Okay, Ilsa?
Yeah, hi. I'm Ilsa Bick. Thanks for inviting me today, by the way. As you said, I'm the author of a couple of different books there. I'm trying to get this into the frame. There I am. I'm the author of the Ashes trilogy. Ashes is the first book in the trilogy, followed by Shadows and then Monsters, which was released last year. This is an apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic trilogy where a wave of EMPs has blanketed the globe, and then everything sort of crashes, civilization falls into a black hole, and everyone is left trying to deal with the aftermath. It takes place predominantly in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and follows Alex, who's a 17-year-old girl with a terminal brain tumor, who's going up there actually to deposit her parents' ashes in Lake Superior, and then probably take an interesting exit herself because her brain tumor is inoperable. And then the world comes tumbling down around her ears, and then she has to find a way to survive. And so the trilogy follows her and the people that she meets along the way. I'm also, in terms of sexual violence, going on with that, I'm also the author of Drowning Instinct, which is probably about as close to a romance as I'm ever going to write, which means that it's fairly twisted and sick, and it's about a 16-year-old girl who's fairly emotionally damaged, and her relationship with a fairly disturbed but very interesting older chemistry teacher. And my latest book to come out is not apocalyptic or dystopian or anything like that. It is White Space. It's the first of a two-part series. The second book, The Dickens Mirror, comes out next year. White Space is a horror book, but also has elements of thrillers and historical fiction and science fiction and fantasy. So it's a gemisch. So if you like gemishes, White Space is for you.
All right, okay. And Elizabeth?
Okay.
So prolific, Ilsa. I am, well, first I want to say, Karen, how amazing I think the Sexual Violence and YA Lit project is, and how useful I think it is as a tool for librarians, for parents. I was telling you before we got on the air how my daughter and I talk about the issues that you bring up in your blog posts. So thank you for taking that on. I know it's a labor of love. The book that I guess we're talking about, it turns out all my books have sexual violence in them. In fact, the only book I have in my possession right now is one that none of you will ever have seen. That's Overboard. Does it show up backwards for you?
Nope.
No, you see it straight forward. All right, so that was my first YA novel, and it actually has a little scene of sexual harassment / violence in it, which I only remembered this morning when I pulled it out. We just moved, for the year at least, to California, which is why I'm outside showing you beautiful California. But that's so that's why I don't have my book with me. They're all at home. So I'm going to pull up the +1 cover on my husband's iPad. Somewhat see that.
There you go.
There you go. Okay, so +1 is my third YA novel. The second one was Monstrous Beauty, which also has a rape scene in it. So there's sexual violence in Monstrous Beauty. But +1 is about, it's an alternate history, and it imagines that we took a different path in history starting at the Spanish flu pandemic. The change that happens is social, cultural, political. The book takes place in contemporary Chicago, but as a result of something that happened around the time of the Spanish flu pandemic, the population is divided into people who must live at night and people who must live during the day with mandated curfews. And the story is about a girl who is night and her dying grandfather. Her brother has been taken, sort of co-opted by the day government because he's extremely talented with computer hacking and cell phone technology. And he's gotten married and had a baby, and her dying grandfather, who's blind, has never seen the baby before. And because they're day and night, they're not entitled to see each other until the equivalent of Thanksgiving, which is called Unity Day. So our heroine gets pissed about this and sets off to kidnap her own niece for a day. She has nothing else. She's going to go for it because she's already on a losing track and she wants to make her grandfather happy. So she deliberately injures herself to get admitted to the day hospital, and with the idea she'll take this baby out, show it to her grandfather, bring it back. But things go a little awry when she runs into a day boy who's a medical apprentice who's a little too smart for his own good and kind of figures out that she's up to something. And they end up going on the run together. There are two instances of sexual violence in the book, and I think for me they tie in with the theme of loss of civil liberties, loss of control over yourself in this environment where politically you're not allowed to live at a certain time of day. And I think that the violence that happens sort of mirrors that lack of control that a person, in this case a woman, can have over her body when someone else has all of the power. So those are my books.
Excellent, thank you. As an aside, I actually want to say Elizabeth's book, Monstrous Beauty, is actually one of the books that really was the impetus for this whole entire project. I read it a couple of years ago and wrote my first post based on that book. And then afterwards just kept talking about it. So Elizabeth kind of, gets credit for the book that just started the whole entire project. Just that reading experience was so significant to me, as you know. So the first thing we want to talk about, I have a question from Krista, who is one of our co-chairs for the project. She wants to know, do you think there are different challenges, either easier or harder, in dealing with the issue of sexual violence or cultural misogyny in dystopians and post-apocalyptics as opposed to contemporary? So how is it different than dealing with it in contemporary fiction? Let's start with Mindy.
Okay. I think that there are a lot of people who would rather think about, number one, and would rather believe the positive and focus on the positive. And I've actually had some people react to Not a Drop to Drink in a way that I hadn't really anticipated. With disbelief, not so much at the climate idea that we would run out of water, but with disbelief that the bad guys, the males, that have set up a kind of a base camp where they barter with various different things, but one of them is sex and women and women's bodies, and women can come in and, you know, have sex with one of them in order to get milk for their baby or gasoline or medicine or something to this effect. And I've had people react to this with nobody would do that. Men wouldn't do that. That wouldn't happen. I've had people say that they don't believe that men of that particular nature, the sexual predatory nature, would group together for their own benefit. And I'm like, really? Because they do it now. They do it today. And I had some really strong reactions to that where people would say that it was sexist. And I don't see that at all. I see it as realistic. And I was actually speaking to a friend of mine that's an adult male, because this had been brought up to me, and it really bothered me, because I was like, well, you know, I kind of internalized it, and I was like, well, wait a minute, am I being overly negative? Am I taking this too far? Am I sexist? And I was talking to an adult male friend of mine that loved the book, and I said, let me ask you something. The guys that are set up down in South Bloomfield and their activities and what they do, I was like, is that? He's like, oh yeah, totally. He's like, that would completely happen. He was like, absolutely, that would happen. And I was like, okay, thank you for being honest. And he was like, yeah. He said, yeah, they're absolutely, completely, that would happen. In fact, decent men would then be pulled into groups like this one because of their strength and because of their lack of morals giving them an edge in this post-apocalyptic society. And I thought it was really kind of cool to have somebody say, yes, I do think that there would be people like that. But I also want to point out there are plenty of positive males in the book as well, but no one wants to talk about that. Everybody's like, oh, she writes bad men. No, there are good guys there too. So in the end, it's just a choice that these characters make as to how they're going to behave towards women, and that's true in post-apocalyptic literature. It's true in contemporary literature. I think that in a book that you're writing for contemporary, people are more likely to, I think, react in a believable way. They find it believable because you see sexual violence all over. I mean, you know, your Twitter feed, whatever is trending, turn on the news, you're going to see sexual violence, and I think that people might believe it more readily, but then they also back away from it more actively in contemporary because it is believable, because it does happen. So I think mentally they might find it less believable, but on a scale as a reader and a parent, they react more strongly to seeing it in contemporary because it's real, which to me, they should have the opposite reaction. Here, read this, learn. You know, but I guess I'm kind of, I don't know, a rebel librarian. So that's how I feel about it. That's my answer to contemporary versus post-apocalyptic sexual violence.
The interesting thing is that the people who are criticizing you aren't extrapolating from possibly their own personal experiences with our country. Because in other countries, that's the behavior of the South Bloomfield men is a daily threat for a lot of in a lot of countries. Trafficking, kidnapping, using it as a form of cash. That sort of thing is actually prevalent in the globe. So. Interesting that they could not believe that it's a potential human behavior given the right circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what you were talking about, Mindy, you know, I was thinking about it because the original question is, you know, is it different or do you portray it differently in contemporary versus a dystopian or apocalyptic? We're done. I think that what I have a lot of different thoughts kind of rattling around. So, and I've been writing things down as people were talking. So give me a second. I think that one of the things that dystopian and apocalyptic literature, as all science fiction and fantasy does, is allow you to take yourself away from the contemporary world where you would like to believe that there are the sort of stops and countermeasures, the things that would keep people safe, the structures that would keep people safe, like judges and courts and police and things like that. You know, somebody bothers you, you call the police. But if you're in a dystopic world or an apocalyptic world where the rules have fallen away and everything is being made new, then I think that it allows you a little bit more freedom to get much more bold in your characterizations. I don't think that the characterizations become caricatures. I don't think you're necessarily exaggerating something that doesn't already exist. What you take away when you go to an apocalyptic or a dystopian scenario is you take away the comfort encounters that would exist in the contemporary world, unless, for example, as Elizabeth pointed out, you go to another country where, in fact, this sort of behavior happens all the time. It was interesting. You were talking about people not believing that this sort of, you know, banding together these people, and then, you know, you have sexual violence or whatever, that would be something that would keep people together. But in fact, if you think about the boy soldiers of Sierra Leone or any of these other countries, where in fact an act of initiation is to go kill somebody, rape somebody, do something terrible. It's completely believable. It's just not within our comfort zone. It's not something that we see every day. However, all you have to do, I think that this is a problem of genre, and that is if you go read thriller genres, crime, mystery genres, crime fiction, that sort of stuff happens in the United States all the time, and it's on television all the time, in gangster films and movies and TV shows and things like that. I think that the sexist thing that can come in is if we say that only men do this sort of thing. And I think that that's the only thing that bothers me just a tad when I read about these episodes of violence that occur, that is, you know, put out there for YA audiences, that somehow or other women don't get as involved in this sort of thing as men do. Because if you think about it, all sexual violence is, and I don't want to make it seem less horrific than it is. But what it really is it's the exercise of power.
Mm-hmm.
And that when you threaten violence of whatever nature, what you're aiming for is to enslave and to empower yourself and to enslave others and to instill fear. And a lot of the times what happens with threats of sexual violence is to men or to women is that the victims become very cowed, they become very complacent, they stop doing the things that make other people, you know, brutalize them. And I'm not saying that the episodes go down, but what has happened is that they become disempowered and they become, you know, essentially, my cat is screaming, and so I'm sitting here trying to think as the cat is saying, "Let me out, you stupid human." And it's like, shut up, you're a cat. And so he's made me lose my train of thought. But I really think that we have to also think about power as being very important here, and that sexual violence is just one way of empowering somebody and showing somebody that you're in charge. And that women are just as capable of men, and just as it can be just as abusive as men. It's just that they're not portrayed as much as men are, because in some ways men are easier. And the other thing, and they are, because it's a cultural stereotype too. Women don't like to think about this sort of thing. But I did spend a lot of time as a forensic psychiatrist in a women's prison, so I treated a lot of sexual predators, and they were all women. So you know, they were all women. I worked in a women's prison, so they were all women. So, and there were no guys there at all. And they were all pretty terrible people, and they were all very much into power and intimidation. And then the last thing I wanted to kind of bring up also for general discussion, though, too, is to think about, you know, sex and violence together. And I know that everyone's going to start throwing tomatoes at their iPads or their computers, but the reality is that if you think about it, sex is actually a somewhat violent act. I know that everyone's going to go, what? But there's a difference. And if you think about the end point of sex and bodies thrashing together, and then the idea of, let's say, when I was a child psychiatrist, this was and worked with very young children, this was when kids would walk in on their parents having sex, and their first thought is, why is daddy hurting mommy? Or why is mommy hurting daddy? In fact, it looks very violent. And in fact, the chemicals that mediate pleasure and pain are very similar. The pathways are very similar. And a lot of them get released during sex. And we all know that there is a very interesting continuum between pleasure and pain in sex. And so to use sex as a way of inflicting violence is, you have to sort of think about, well, what is violence in and of itself, and why is violence pleasurable? Because in fact, violence can be quite pleasurable to people and mediate the same pathways as sex. And now I'll stop talking. And I'm going to let out my cat before he drives me insane. Go, someone else talk.
I have only recently been introduced to this argument, which just shows that I've been living under a rock, that normal, healthy sex contains a element of violence, although where I heard it was not as eloquently worded as Ilsa has. Just that the physical act of there is a group apparently on the internet who believe that the physical act of sex is already, just by our physiologies, a dominant act on the part of the man. I think this is a little to the side of what you're saying, but also dangerous territory to go into because
Chris, no one's going to throw tomatoes at you in real life.
No, they'll just watch this and throw email tomatoes. It's an argument I hadn't thought of before, because I've had mostly very healthy sexual relationships, so I don't see the different way that men and women experience sex to be to have any connotation of dominance, but there is a group of people who do, and I would say
dominance is not the same as violence, though.
Yeah, they're equating it with violence. They think the act of penetration is violent, even in a consensual event. I've only skimmed the surface of this online discussion, and I'm not sure it's helpful with what we're talking about. I wonder whether, to go back to Krista's original question, I wonder whether contemporary writers, and you could argue that +1 is sort of contemporary because it takes as given. It's Chicago. It's now almost everything is exactly the same, except for this division. So it is a society with law and order, a little bit repressive law and order. But that is what actually the law and order is what gives rise to the coercive sexual event that happens in the book, which is that there are hour guards who roam around checking your ID to make sure that if it's daytime, you are a day person, and they have too much power in the sense of being able to look at all of your documents, which are on your phone, so they can look at anything they want to look at. And in this particular case, the hour guard uses the facts that he knows about one of the characters. He uses the fact that he can hurt her by pulling in her companions, uses that to get a sexual favor from her. So there's a case where it's not Sierra Leone. It's sort of the opposite. The government has too much power, and therefore individuals with the power can abuse it. But I
corrupt cop, right?
I'm sorry.
It's corrupt cop. Again, it could be quite contemporary with the corrupt cop.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the dystopic scenario. I'm gonna have to mute that. I think the dystopic scenario that Mindy has allows more of this experience of lack of law and order, more of a group behavior. I'm just saying, I can imagine with contemporary, you're limited to these sort of corrupt individuals or sick individuals or power hungry in the case of sexual violence individuals, whereas with a dystopia, you can broaden it to be a commentary on what happens when there's a breakdown, when the artificial ways that we keep control are taken away.
I think of it as being kind of like this continuum of history, because you look back at like some of our original history, and before we started evolving and thinking more about women's rights and things like that, there was a different view of women and more sexual violence, towards women. Not necessarily more, but I think it was more like accepted on the surface. I mean, when like you read through history, and part of going in and conquering another nation was like you went in and you stole their goods and you raped their women, and then we kind of got more, I don't know, civilized, if that's the word you want to use, and and then women started pressing for women's rights, and we started having conversations about sexual violence. And so this idea that when society breaks down again, because some type of a apocalyptic event, and because a lot of what keeps people safe is in some ways a superficial construct, because like the government and laws and those types of things, and then and those are those things that we evolve during this continuum, and then it all breaks down again. And to me, post-apocalyptic fiction sometimes resembles some of our earlier history, and so it's this idea that it's...
Yes, to a degree, I agree with that, because, I mean, that, to me, it's like that's part of the reason why I wrote Not a Drop to Drink, because once you lose all those social constructs, like the law, like the idea that if you do something bad, you will get in trouble, that is, the thing that bothers me is that why is because they're going to get in trouble, or do they not do it because it is wrong and they believe it is wrong, and therefore they will not do that? And the reason why I bring this up is because what you're saying about history and in the past, I mean, you are right to a degree, but they are, especially in the East, there have been plenty of archaeological discoveries where there were women, there were tribes that were matriarchal. There are plenty of societies that did have extreme respect for women, and women were running, and I don't just mean the Amazons. There are plenty of societies where women were in charge. Men and women were living together, and women were running the show. And they weren't raping women simply because they weren't supposed to. They weren't raping women because they respected them. And so that's one of the things that I think is interesting when you're looking at our society today in real life. Are people not committing rape because they're afraid of being punished, or because it is in fact wrong to do it? And I think that comes down to a question not so much of our laws and what they're supposed to do, but our society and our perception of women, our social constructs. Because if the only thing that's stopping you from committing rape is that you're going to get in trouble, then we've already lost.
This is, I think, why people who are watching this should know that it happened right after Emma Watson's speech to the UN about the he for she, and I think that's part of what she's aiming for, is that the way to curtail, to bring equality to women in various fields, but also curtail this sort of sexual violence we're talking about, is to have boys grow up understanding that it's in their interest to have gender equality, to respect women, to have it become such part of your raising internal that it is your morals.
I think definitely part of it is definitely the whole idea of, respecting people, and certainly gender issues is part of it, because, I do a lot of, I'm in no way qualified necessarily to talk on this topic, but I read everything that comes out, and it's definitely
yourself. You have a PhD now.
But, definitely gender equality and this idea of respect that Mindy is talking about. And I think that's, too, also why I mentioned the idea of, this kind of this arc of women's, the women's movement. Definitely the idea of respect is part of it. I think there's always going to be a portion of the population who, I don't know what the right term is, Ilsa would know, but they're sociopaths or psychopaths or whatever, and they're just not acting because they don't want to get caught. And then there's, I don't think that there's any one necessarily cause. And then there are those where, they don't they don't understand what consent is. They don't understand when they're crossing the line. Or, there's those respect issues. The idea, you sometimes talk about, generally it's spoken in terms of men, but it certainly applies to women too. This idea that you're entitled to something, which, and that's another element of, I think, just respecting other people. So, gender roles and gender equality, certainly is an important part of the conversation. I see Ilsa over there making faces, so.
Because there are so many things that people are saying that I am going like, wait, or what about this? I actually go back to what Mindy was saying before about, do you do it because you don't get caught or because you know that it's wrong? And I think that is actually, again, I think that, and this is not to be the wet rag or whatever on the party, but I think that we do ourselves a disservice if we focus only on women, and if we focus only on rape, and we make it all about women. Let's just talk about right and wrong and power and all that stuff, because I think that that's much more to the point. And let's be honest. I think that if we weren't afraid of getting caught, a lot of us would do a lot of terrible things, or things that we think would be wrong or bad. If you see something that you want and you want it badly enough, well, if you're not going to get into trouble, if you think you can get away with it, you might steal it. And I think that a lot of that can become something that's ingrained in you very early, like you don't do this. And that then talks about, early parenting and all that sort of stuff, and then societal what's the word I'm looking for? Somebody help me. I'm a writer and I can't even find it. It's the thing that props it up, whatever. Societal reinforcements. Jeez, man, oh man. If you have reinforcements to say don't do this, then you won't do it, and then it becomes something that you shouldn't ever do. But it doesn't actually evolve as something that you know from the get-go, because all of us have needs and wants, and we all want to go and have that nice piece of candy, or we want what Johnny has, or we want what Jamie has, or whatever. We just eventually don't do it, because when we are caught, it's not very pleasant when you do get caught, because your parents ground you and they do terrible things to you. Or if you hit your brother one too many times, they'll tell you you can't watch Star Trek anymore. And it's like, okay, you then weigh, do I want to watch Star Trek or do I want to hit my brother more? So what you do is that you find out sneaky ways to hit your brother so that your parents don't ever find out. That doesn't mean that you're obeying laws. You just putting yourself in a position where you won't get caught. And I think that the idea of the law being something that is we can all sort of internalize and abide by is a very comforting fallacy. And that most of us, when put into situations where the need is very great, would probably go ahead and break that law. Especially even ones that you think you would never break. For example, there's a question that I always ask kids that comes up frequently because of my books, and I say, so how many of you would eat somebody? If you were starving, how many of you would eat somebody? And there are always a bunch of kids who say, oh yeah, I would, and then there are a bunch of kids who say, I would never. And then a bunch of more thoughtful kids who say, I'm not sure. And I'd say to the kids who say that they would never, then I'd say, well, I guess you've never been starving. And then the kids who say they would, I said, well, it may not be as easy to cut off a piece of somebody's arm as you think.
But this is not a morality question.
Yes, it is. For a lot of people, it is. It's a very moral issue. Do you eat a person or not? Of course, it's a moral issue because a lot of it's about a very religious issue on whether or not you eat a person. There's nothing sacred about a human body per se, but a lot of people simply would not cannibalize another person. And they cast it in very moral terms. It's the wrong thing to do.
There's no victim in this crime, though.
Sorry.
There's no victim in this crime.
There is a victim to the crime in terms of their philosophical point of view. And I'm positing it as a different type of question. That is, that there are some things that people think they would never do, but then could get pushed into doing if the need is great enough, or they think they can get away with it. And I think that's...
Well, I agree with that in some sense, because yes, I mean that's one of the big things I try to raise in Not a Drop to Drink, because a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, she's killing people. It's a gray area, and there can be a gray area when you're specifically talking about in terms of survival. Would I eat someone? Yeah, I can tell you right now, if I had to, if I was going to die, if I didn't eat a dead body, yes, I would totally eat it. So fine, I can do that.
If you're in a group that says if you want to eat, you will now, gouge, you will now rape this boy, you will rape this girl, would you do that? And that
I would like to think no.
Right. But you've never been starving.
Right. And that's a good question, but I don't think there's a situation where, and just for the point of illustration, we'll say a male has to have sex or he's going to die. They might think they're going to die, but probably not. Now, like you're saying, in a situation, because I know that this does happen, but there are situations where they're under some form of threat from an outside source, etc. Yes, that obviously is a completely different situation. But in a one-on-one, more simplistic, obviously, but I can see gray areas where you're going to die if you don't steal food. You're going to die if you don't eat that dead body. You're going to die, your child is going to die if you don't kill someone else. Okay, I can see that gray area, but when it comes to, I don't think sex is necessary for personal survival. Happiness, maybe. Survival of the species, sure. But beyond that, yeah, it's not even a gray area so much as it's like a pixelated area. Like I don't even know. I mean, yeah, it's a question. But I think once you start throwing out situational, well, what if there's a gun to your head? Would you rape someone? Then you're going to end up with a laundry list.
Well, of course, but that is what we were talking about, because nothing is black and white, and I think that's where I really want to try and maybe throw in a little bit of pixelation or gray, because I think that it doesn't necessarily further a discussion about what this is all about to make it so very black and white, because I don't think that every society operates that way, or every situation. And if you're a kid in the inner city who happens to belong to a gang, and they get a girl and it's your turn, do you do it or not? Do you want to belong to that gang or not? Do you do it even though you know it's wrong? So I think that there are a lot of shades of gray that's too easy to gloss over. That's all.
Can I ask one of the questions I submitted to?
Go for it.
It's slightly changing the topic, but bringing it back to dystopia, which is, as writers, and probably we'll get some writers tuning in, do you feel like there is a danger of sexual violence in your writing acting as a placeholder for this is a bad society, this is a corrupt society, this is there a point at which it's gratuitous or it's not thoughtful, and it's there to tell the reader that this is a horrible, bad place. This is my character's conflict. They live in this horrible, bad place. Ilsa was shaking her head no, but I think there's a danger in that, and I think as writers we have to be super careful that we use this not as a tool, but for painting a setting, but as a thematic contribution to the literature that the book is.
Well, then let me ask, because I mean, that's an excellent question. It kind of reminds me about, and I know you're going to say, well, that is so off topic, but I'll get back to it. It reminds me of Steven Spielberg when he always uses the Nazis as the shorthand for really, really evil, right? Because Nazis become you see a Nazi, oh my God, these people are totally evil because they're all Nazis. And it's the same, what you're essentially saying too, is that if you want to say that something is really evil, you have sexual exploitation and violence, and that's sort of a shorthand for, boy, aren't these guys bad, rather than a more thoughtful exploration of what the society is about. And so I guess I would turn that around to you. Do you think that that's something that you run into as a danger for you in your writing? Since you said, went back and looked at all your books and said, boy, I use this in all my books.
I think I think the comment about it being in my books is a reflection of, and I don't know if this is true of the two of you, but a reflection of being a woman and having, I believe that the statistics about sexual violence are a bit low because I think every woman has had, on a continuum of, and I wouldn't, violence at one end, but there's another end that is uncomfortable, that I think almost every woman, I mean, unless you have taken a vow of celibacy and never had a relationship, I think everyone, and even as a child, I remember in Italy when I was 10, I had a man pinch my bottom in a restaurant. So even if that were the only thing that I could list, and I can actually list more, I have experienced a form of unwanted sexual contact. So I think that those things being in my novels reflects being that this is a core part of who we are as women, and so it's something that I work on, and my subconscious works on, and it makes its way into the book. But in Plus One, I did worry. I wanted this society to be. It's not a dystopia. I mean, I think of an alternate history as I don't know. It's not. It's like, well, I've said this on Twitter. It's a dystopia if you think of pre-civil rights America as being a dystopia, which maybe you should.
My mother would agree.
Yeah, exactly. But I did worry that I didn't want to paint this as I didn't want this to be shorthand for a bad society. And in the particular event that happens, it is a coercive sexual event, and I took pains to tie it in with this theme of social injustice and of loss of control of personal freedoms. So that was the way that I handled it. But there are a plethora of dystopias and apocalyptic scenarios out there where women get raped, and it's it I don't know, loses its value as a piece of literature, I think.
Mm-hmm.
No fair throwing it back at me.
Sure it is. I think that when I'm thinking back of all the books that I've written, there's really no overt sexual violence in Ashes per se. There's a repressive society where women have certain roles, and the girls are not allowed to do certain things, and that is probably about as close as I actually get. There are maybe one or two. In Shadows there and Monsters is more, but that's more in the terms of brutalization. I actually didn't really think about sexual violence per se, and I don't use it that often necessarily in my books because I think that there are so many other horrific ways in which people are violent to one another, and the situations don't really call for it either. I mean, so maybe that's an answer to the question. You know, if I'm going to use a sexually violent situation in a book, it serves a purpose for the book and for the story. It's not a placeholder for, and isn't this a really bad person?
Yeah. I disagree, though. I think Ashes has, well, so it's this continuum.
Yeah, it was
where there's the town, is it rural?
Yeah.
So women are sort of chosen to homestead, and it's expected of them, and it was implied that they don't really have a choice. They get handpicked by the boy who wants them. That is definitely on the continuum. Yeah. I would say you write sexual violence, whether there's an act of violence in there.
Yeah, and I take issue with the word violence. I write about power, I think that again we diminish violence if we don't acknowledge power.
Yeah. Yeah.
I write about power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think I was asking this question, and Mindy can jump in, to talk to writers about what things they might look out for.
I think Mindy is frozen because I see her looking concerned, but
yeah. She has texted me that she's having some technical difficulties, so I'm not sure that right this moment she is with us. But I think it's interesting because Elizabeth brought up Ashes, and of course I have read the whole trilogy, and I think the way that the place of rule is set up, you know, just by totally taking away the female choice, you know, to me that's like totally like so horrific to even contemplate, you know.
Well,
and I mean, and like they're being, you know, and held there against their will, and being partnered with men without the choice to be, you know, to select their own partner, and you know, it's definitely, you know, subtle in some ways, and it's, you know, it's not rape, and it's, you know, but it's like
it's all the more powerful. It's all the more powerful for being subtle, I think.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's why I said I write about power and inequalities in power, and this is just one other way of doing it. Poor Mindy is frozen twice on my screen. But yeah, and I you know, I was thinking about this in terms of other books in general. I'll just stop talking. I'm thinking about violence and power, and they're just two different things. Although people can sometimes become violent to get power. You know, it was funny because I was reading a biography of a woman who lived in a very strict Christian sect. Never was never, you know, abused, physically abused. There was not violence, things like that. But they were a very strict Christian sect. And, you know, they weren't the guy made all the decisions, and they had all the Bible verses to back that up. And that, to me, was, you know, she talked about finally breaking away from that. Sex only entered into it a little bit, but she was talking more about the repression and the power, and I think that's where I was thinking when I was going with rule and things like that. You know, being Jewish, of course, I don't know a ton about, you know, fundamentalist Christian sex, but I do know a fair amount about fundamentalist Jewish sex, and the women are, especially in some of the more ultra-Orthodox, are highly repressed. And treated as objects and treated as things that are possessed. Some of the sects, they actually shave their heads and wear wigs because the idea is to become unattractive to other men, so that, you know, if the house is ever overrun, this is like from way back in the days of the pogroms and stuff, the house is ever overrun, then the bad guys who overrun you won't find people attractive and won't rape you. and won't take you away. So that kind of, it cuts across all cultures, I think. But again, violence to me connotes something very specific, and so I'll stop, talking because I get very hung up about the power and the violence thing, because they are so very different. And I think that violence in and of itself can be a way of establishing power and then showing that this is a person who is bent on gaining power, or a culture that's bent on gaining power. But that shouldn't be and can't be the only thing that the book is about.
Is Mindy back?
Oh, Mindy is blinking.
Oh, yay.
I'm here, I'm moving, everything. Well, I think one of the things that Ilsa said that I think is interesting, and I know that it's a reflection of the culture perception more than anything, but one of the first things I did when I went to college was that I took a self-defense class, because I'm an athlete, I've always been an athlete, and I was muscular, etc., but I didn't know anything about actually defending myself. Well, with a guy, with anybody, I didn't know how to do these things. And one of the things that I think is interesting that Ilsa said, that of the cultures where they would try to, I guess, up in order to avoid being raped, is that is one of the very first things that was brought up to us in our self-defense class, was that attractiveness is not because it is not necessarily about sex, it is about power. Right. It is about exhibiting control over another human being, and it doesn't matter what you look like. And a lot of times, and this is something I have a problem with in our, especially in movies and TV rape culture, is that the rape victim is usually an attractive woman, and that eroticizes sex right out the door. Eroticizes rape right out the door. They don't show you the elderly women. They get 90-year-old women that get raped, and they do. They don't show you pregnant women getting raped, and they do. They don't show you overweight women or any other of these things that we consider attractive qualities. When a woman being raped, she's attractive, and that's a problem. That's a problem, because it doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter your race. It doesn't matter your gender. None of these things matter. You are a potential rape victim at all times. And I think that is something that I think it contributes to the eroticism of rape, is that rape victims are always portrayed as attractive people. And I think that's a problem. That's a big social problem, because these women that are attempting to shave their heads or do whatever it is that they are attempting to do in order to make themselves less of a target, it's a completely false sense of security, because rape is usually not about sex. It's about power, which is, I think, part of what Ilsa is saying. And I think I read a really interesting article one time that was talking about when it comes to, I don't know how it's done now, but it used to be that they weren't sure how to classify rape. Is it in a sense of a jury or a crime? Is it a violent crime or is it a sex crime? And one of the really interesting quotes that I read is that it's a violent crime where sex is the weapon. Which I found very fascinating.
That is interesting. It's funny, too, when you were talking about, that was one of the things that I learned in self-defense, too, and then having been in the military, and I think, again, that the military is a very interesting place to be, too, because you've got people with all sorts of power who are, higher ranking than you, and there's all sorts of very interesting intimidation, and I know that and again, it's usually about the exercise of power over somebody else, because to be really honest with you, when I'm in my BDUs and my hair is all whatever, and I look, and I've just been on the obstacle course or whatever I was doing, we weren't all of us all that terrifically attractive, but that didn't stop guys from, especially higher ranking guys, from kind of pressing themselves on you, or making suggestive comments and things like that when you were, where you were just a grunt. It was very interesting when I got older and would walk this, streets at night and stuff like that, around Washington, D.C., that I would deliberately dress myself down.
Yeah.
Wear a sweatshirt, wear a hood. I actually went so far at one point in my life where I was smoking a cigar. as I walked along. And boy, that sure made sure that people didn't bother me. It's like, who is this crazy woman with the cigar? So, you know, there's definitely an element of that I think in popular culture that always happens. But in fact, in reality, it really does seem to be that the people who are victimized are the ones who are, you know, victimized by people who perceive that the positions in which they assail you cannot be themselves assailed. That is, that they are so powerful that you can't do anything back to them. Mm-hmm. And that certainly happened repeatedly in the military. There was never the best moment of my life was when I had a colonel who was browbeating one of my sergeants. And I was able to say, get the hell out of my clinic. And he says, I outrank you. And I said, I don't care. I'm in charge of this clinic. Get the hell out of my clinic. And then I reported him. So that was a wonderful moment. But it was about power.
I think in our books, and I think it's in all three of our books, there's always a counter example. There's always a healthy relationship that I think is to contrast. It's always a person who doesn't want to have power over the other character as a way of juxtaposing against what you see in the broader society.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that's our unconscious. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't do that consciously. It just sort of happens. You know.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. It's my id counterbalancing my. What is it, Ilsa?
Maybe what it is that you're applying an unconscious corrective whether you know it or not. Because I think that if you go into any of our books, or any writer, and this is just a writerly thing, and maybe this is stupid, but I think that if you go and you try and plan this out too much, and you don't let yourself, because you know, if you think about it, we may all be against this, but in order to actually write this convincingly, we had to inhabit the minds of the people who perpetrate the violence.
Sure, absolutely, I agree with that 100%.
So again, that we're all capable of this, and then probably what happens as writers is that at some level you also say, wait, there has to be a better, different way. I don't know about you. I don't go out to write about morals and stuff like that when I write a book. I just tell a story. And if a moral happens to come out of it, good, you know, yay. But I just want to tell as emotionally true a story as I possibly can. And in order to do that, that means that I have to be very evil and terrible and violent. And then I also have to hope that sometimes I'm also good. So that comes out too, and that, you know, because I think that if we all wrote Debbie Downer stories constantly, where at the end everyone wanted to kill themselves, no one would read us.
No.
At a certain level, when you read a mystery or a crime thriller or an apocalyptic or a dystopian or whatever, we're all trying to end on a note of hope. That in fact, however bad things are, there are some people somewhere who are inherently good and will do the right thing. And here, kids, this is the way you do it. Or here, you know, adults, this is the way you do it. This is the way we would do it. Right?
Okay, so we're technically out of time, but whatever. We're going to keep talking for a second, because I got to tell you a story about Mindy's book. In that, you know, there's a scene in Mindy's book where this group of men come and, Mindy, what's the main character's name again? I can't think of it.
Lynn.
You know, there's several people, you know, holed up at Lynn's house, and these men come and they say they'll leave if they'll give them this woman, this girl, and she leaves with them. But she's like, no, it's okay, because she leaves knowing that she's going to take her life. So,
yeah.
You know, because, you know, they are taking her to be, you know, basically, you know, a sex slave. And I had finished reading the book, and at the same time, I had watched this special on PBS about the African American experience in the United States, and they had told the story of a slave who had escaped from Kentucky to Ohio and got captured, and she was on a boat on the way back to, you know, slavery in Kentucky, and she had 2 children, and she, on the boat, drowned her children. And I was with a friend of mine and both of our husbands, and I was saying, like, if, you know, the apocalypse ever happens, the first thing I want to do is find some cyanide pills, because I have 2 little girls, and I thought, you know, so if they ever get captured, you know, by a group of men, or, you know, seem to be in that type of situation, they could just, you know, take care of the situation. And she's like, you'd rather your children be dead than be sex slaves? And I'm like, yes, I would. But that's just, my personal opinion. And I mean, I hope, honestly, that's never tested, obviously. But I thought it was, to me, it's a really interesting, question about this whole idea of like, in these relationships and whatever spectrum they're on, there's this, this level of just complete, total harassment and violation and just constant fear. And Ilsa asked the question earlier, like, like if you were in a situation, where you were starving, would you be willing to, eat a corpse, but it's like, what are the limits of what, people can survive? And of course we get a different point of view because we have this situation with the 3 ladies in Ohio who were recently, found who had survived like, 10 years.
Yes.
So that probably is a counter argument to my, I would give them cyanide pills. But the literature to me always raises really interesting questions about what it is, like the limits of what people on the other end. We've talked a lot about the perpetrator, but talk like on the other end about the victims of sexual violence and how they heal with or deal with the trauma and whether they can then later process that information. Like Elizabeth, we can look at the character whose name I think starts with a G, and her, her situation in +1.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
Gigi.
Yes. No, you guys know my secret. I'm bad at remembering characters' names. Super bad. I always write it on the back of the book when I go do book talks in the school because I'm like, I don't remember anybody's names. Or the characters in Not a Drop to Drink. I guess I just want to talk for a few minutes. We've talked a lot about the perpetrators, about the other side of it, and talk about the victims, the survivors, whatever term we want to choose to call them, and how they're portrayed in your books and in young adult literature, and what the takeaway for readers can be for that.
Do you want me to go first?
Go first.
I'll go first. Yeah, sure. Well, especially in Neva's case, the character that you're speaking of, that particular scene, she had already been a victim of gang rape, which was just alluded to, but she had been raped. And this is a woman who already had some mental issues. She struggled with depression before she was even in a situation where she was raped. She was from a very a blessed life. She was from a family that had money and wealth and safety. And even with these things, she had struggles. She had depression. And then you take this woman who has had a very blessed life in this post-apocalyptic society where she is protected and she is cared for, and she ends up in a situation where she is gang raped, and she can't come back from that because she hasn't experienced this. She hasn't been in a situation where she wasn't respected in her life until she is degraded in one of the worst possible ways by many people, and she can't bounce back. She can't do it. As she tries so hard for her daughter, for Lucy, and it breaks her. And she is not able to recover from that. And unfortunately, there are people that cannot come back, and it's not necessarily a weakness in their character, of course not. It is more of a reaction to having something done to you that is so visceral and so violent. If you've ever had your house broken into,
No.
It's horrible. It's a horrible experience, even if you come home and they're gone. And then you walk around your house and you look at your own home differently. Someone was in here, someone touched this, someone was in my space, and you've been invaded. But then turn that around and it's your body. Your body has been invaded. This is yours and it was taken from you. And you can't escape that. You can't walk away from that. It's nothing that you can't leave it behind. You can't move. You can't sell your house, You're not able to do that. It's your body that this has been done to. And she cannot walk away from this. She can't recover. and then she ends up in a situation where she knows this is going to happen again, for sure. She knows that this is what these men have in store for her, and she refuses to accept that. So it's definitely a gray area. When I was writing the book, I don't plan, like Ilsa was saying, I don't plan anything, I just write the book. And that scene, that particular scene, and the choice that Neva makes in order to escape her fate was not planned. She did that. That was her choice. And I was stunned. And as soon as I wrote it, I was like, well, that's an issue raiser. But you know what? It is an option, and this is an option that she chose. And my character, she couldn't recover from having that kind of violence perpetrated upon her. And I certainly would like to think that we all have the ability to recover from such things when we're in a situation where we have care and we have support and we have the talk to. And my character in this particular situation didn't have any of those things. After she had this violence visited upon her, she didn't have enough of a support system. She retreated into herself. This mental problem that she had before then is combined with this trauma that she's been through, and she can't share, she can't talk, she can't do anything. All she can think of is protect myself, protect myself. And within that is not sharing yourself anymore, not sharing anything with anyone. And this is part of what implodes her, is that she's not able to get any of this darkness that has been visited upon her and that has been in her brain, her life. She was born with this problem, this depression, combined with this external force, that she completely takes all of these things and holds them inside of her and self-destructs. She implodes. And I think that is one of the takeaway messages for me in that particular character's story and the end of her story, is that you cannot skip over it. You can't cut that scene from your life. You can't just say, this happened and it's behind me, and I'm not going to talk about it, I'm done. That didn't happen, let's pretend it didn't happen. That is going to, it's going to rot, it's going to be in your head. You're not going to be able to process this alone. And this is something that I feel Neva tried to do, and with disastrous results. I would like to think that if you have a support system and if you have the ability to reach out to others and you're strong in your convictions of yourself that this has been done to you and that this was wrong, that you're able to come back from such an event. So in that particular character's story, she didn't have any of the things that she needed, I don't think, to help her recover. So that's a very long answer, I think, to what you asked me.
You bring up some interesting questions, though, and I think that the one that, I mean, we were talking about it in terms of literature and stuff, and the thing that books and films allow us to do is to paint extremes, to show what happens when people are, act in a very extreme way. And I think that one of the things you said is that there's no one unitary answer about what's right for everybody. And in terms of real life, having dealt with this in real life, as a shrink, and also then dealing with a lot of veterans with PTSD, I can tell you that there's a very popular, it's sort of like dealing with cancer, that everyone should deal with cancer by fighting it. Well, that actually doesn't work for everybody. That's a cultural thing, and that everyone has their own way of dealing with when you have cancer. And I know some women who say, don't tell me to fight this. This is not, leave me alone. This doesn't work for me. And it's the same sort of thing with trauma. The trauma in and of itself, talking about it or having support systems isn't necessarily what helps everybody. And that what is good for one person isn't really necessarily good for somebody else. And I'm thinking not only of veterans who actually find, there are plenty of them who have PTSD and have had it for years, but find it better not to talk about it. Because in fact, talking about it too much actually for them brings up too much anxiety and they can't function. So for them, it is better for them to have developed a mechanism where they just cope. It becomes a black area. They don't talk about it. But I'm also thinking about my own father. And my dad, and I bring this up because we're talking about something that's been going on now for years. And this is not about sex, My dad is a Holocaust survivor. He was in 3 different camps. They came for him when he was a very young boy, and he was in camps until he was about 11 or 12. Everyone in his family died, except for his grandmother. He never knew that she had survived. She went back to their old village and died there, and he didn't find out until he was 70 years old. And to this day, my father cannot talk about this, does not talk about it. I know virtually nothing about his history. He's never had a cathartic moment. We've never, we've all not all dealt with this or anything like this. And that is the way he is. He still has some of the behaviors too. Like, you see some people when they've been in prisons or they've been soldiers, they guard their food, that type of thing. You make sure nobody snatches your food. My dad still does that, guards his food. He has a bad temper. That type of thing. He's still a nice guy, but he's in his 80s yet now, and I'm not as afraid of him as I used to be. But for him, this is a black hole where you cannot go. Just because he hasn't, quote, dealt with it, talked about it, whatever, doesn't mean that his life has not continued. It's the way in which he copes. And so I think that for us, in terms of novelists, there are ways that we can take the same issues and show how different people can cope with it, or not, as in the case of your character, and that there's not one unitary answer, that there is no one shining example, that this is the best way. It's only the way that works best for you.
Yeah, I have, I think Karen was talking about Gigi, her way of dealing with it in that spectrum of ways of dealing with things is to become sort of hardened and she has a rough edge and has really strong control over every other aspect of her, what she can control. She controls very well. In fact, my little novella, the little short story that goes with it, it's written in her voice, and I think you see how tough she is as a result. She's made up for it in other ways. And I think there's a tiny little thing that happens to the main character when she's young, and I think the way you see, and this is very subtle, the author has to tell you to find it, but what you see is her processing it when she's having a healthy sexual encounter. She processes that unhealthy thing that happened to her and makes the choice to have the kind of experience with the boy in that moment that corrects what happened to her before, that is consensual and delightful and fun.
Yeah. Well, Mindy has to get back to work, so we are going to. Mindy's not only an author, but she's a school librarian. She's at school. That bell you kept hearing was the school bell.
Yeah, periods have gone by, rolling by.
Yeah. But if you stick around long enough, you'll get to hear what's for lunch.
Yay. So, Mindy, I want to thank you for your time and you. Great conversation and lots of insight. Every time this happens, I think we could just keep talking forever because it's
definitely
such a thoughtful conversation. And I do thank you guys for your time. I'm going to stop the broadcast. So thank you, everybody who's watching.
Nice to see you.
Take care.